Charles Escher, would you be so kind as to come forward? And we're not going to do the official introduction thing. I mean, this is not the kind of meeting that we prefer an approach like that. You're well known of the Van Abbe Museum. Let me start off with a small question before we're going to listen to your speech. When it comes to these kinds of subjects that we're going to be discussing with each other, and what do you consider, before we're going to listen to what you know, what do you consider your biggest dilemma in this field? What do you not know?
I don't know if art and culture are completely the right place to do what I want to do.
Then why the hell are you director of the Van Abbe Museum?
Because it's the best option available at the moment.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try and explain why. But I think we have to remain self-critical of our own disciplinary borders and understand that we need to maybe abandon them at certain points. So I always want to question whether art is actually the place where it's happened.
Yeah.
I've always answered to the question probably, so that's why I've stayed.
Can you give me one moment, one illustration of a situation that made you doubt about this?
I think it's the fact that I would like much more immediate results. And I know that in art and culture you're talking about an investment which lasts possibly more than a lifetime. That what happens in the field of emergent culture has an effect on the larger scale over 30, 40, 50 years.
Yeah, when you're dead.
Or old at least.
Yeah.
Maybe. And I think sometimes you feel it would be nice to have something more immediate to come back to.
Yesterday. Yeah. Okay, we're going to listen to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm really delighted to be able to set this little structure up to consider these three questions of the economic, the political, and cultural, which are, in a sense, as Ingmar Bergman also said, one question, looked at from three different points of view. As Frank knows, and probably you all know, I was brought up on what used to be called the left, and I had a certain commitment to those old values like liberty, equality, and brotherhood. And also emancipation, I think, which was something that I think many human beings have. I don't necessarily think that even the far right necessarily wants to abandon those ideals. But the question is how to express them. And I've, in my culturally active and also politically active lifetime, I've experienced critique, criticality, criticism, the critical, as the way in which we negotiate and discuss our field and understand our relationship to the world. In other words, we're always thinking about what's wrong, and we're always thinking about why it's wrong and how it's wrong. But I think that the conditions of the world, whether that's political, whether that's economic, whether that's cultural today, require us to think beyond that. Criticality is necessary, but it's not enough. And we need to step beyond that. And we need to start to be propositional from what used to be the left, which I would no longer associate myself with particularly, from what used to be that field which believed in the emancipation of the individual and the collective. So in my 10 minutes, I want to try and outline a quite simple proposal for a cultural step that would be based on museum collections, because in the end you act according to your own field and you act within the very limited space for movement that you have as an individual. But in order to do that, in order to get to that proposal, which I hope has an element of radicalism in it, I want to sketch a very partial history. Let's agree that society is composed of three pillars. They are the economic, the political, and the cultural. You can see this back even in medieval archetypes. You have the merchant, the warrior, and the monk. These three roles. And you can see it also in the most basic things that we do together as a society. We trade and exchange with each other, we exercise power over each other, and we share beliefs. But these three systems all have radically different value systems. The value of the merchant means nothing to the warrior. The value of the monk means nothing to the merchant. Of course, these are archetypes. As individuals, we have these all in ourselves. But as archetypes, they have different value systems. Now, what I fear, what I've seen in the last 20 years since the mid-1980s and accelerating after 1989 is that one of these three pillars has become super dominant. Not only dominant in that it is the leading value, but under a neoliberalist hegemony, which is what we face, a very, very singular worldview which comes out of neoliberalism. It has displaced all the others. Thus, both politics and culture, as fields with these independent value systems, have been set aside, marginalized, put in the realm of the emotion or an individual, put in the realm of the private. And that meaningful value is perceived largely, almost only, in terms of the contribution it can make to economic success. You can see this in the political language, where such terms as I was brought up with from Margaret Thatcher, there is no alternative, or in 1989, the end of history, show you that neoliberalism tries to impose itself not as an ideological choice, but as an absolute hard inevitability. This is the only option. That's what we're told. Now, I think, and I hope, that we can all agree that that's not a good way to go on. That having only one option for our society, having only one option for ourselves, how to be a good consumer, is not sufficient to encapsulate the complexity of us as individuals, what's going on in each of your hearts and your minds and your bodies. So we need to rebalance our public discourse. And especially, we need to rebalance it in the face of a mediascape that does not allow that rebalancing to happen because of ownership, because of very many other things. So we need to find spaces in which that rebalancing can take place, and it won't be in the media, or not the media that we currently understand. And we need to rebalance it towards both real political questions. What is democracy? How do we want to be governed? How do we want to exercise power over each other? And also real cultural questions. How do we feel about this society? What do we want to leave behind for coming generations? These questions need to have the value that economic questions have today. And these questions cannot be answered by economics in general, I would suggest, but only in combination between economics, culture, and politics. Let alone the idea that free market neoliberalism is going to answer these questions, which is absolutely absurd. Instead of a single value, we need to realize that we are dealing with far more complex, or we might call super complex systems, for which there is very little chance of constructing effective, predictive analysis. And what I think we need to do, and this is hard, but it's necessary for us all to try in our different fields, we need to embrace this super complexity, this super diversity. We need to embrace it and we need to revel in it, rather than flee to simplistic but attractive populist solutions. And how on earth can we embrace super complexity, super diversity in a meaningful way? We clearly, I think, need help in order to achieve that. We can even use concepts that are developed from maximizing commercial profit in economics or from science, things like emergent behavior, or even Adam Smith's famous idea of the invisible hand. You know, when he talked about the invisible hand, he talked about it as if it were an invisible hand, the market organizes itself. He didn't mean there was an overwhelming power. He said it was as if it existed. But actually what he was talking about, if we translate it in today's terms, is emergent behavior. And those emergent behaviors need platforms. They need platforms in which a staging can happen, a peaceful confrontation can happen between economic, cultural, and political value systems. This, I would suggest, needs to happen at the local level to be effective, while having international, or even better, I would want to say planetary, because I think we need to think about the planet in these terms, planetary ambition to be meaningful. So the question and the proposition I want to make would allow this confrontation to take place, and would allow the emergent possibilities, not control from above, but create the means in which something can emerge from below, which we don't know beforehand. And that will again, and it will produce, if we can allow these platforms, the possibility of communicating it within a wider public sphere. So what is my proposal today? My proposal is based on an old adage coined by an American art historian, actually British art historian, T.J. Clarke. He said very simply, modernity is our antiquity. In other words, modernity, the modernity that we have, is the basic aesthetic and cultural layer, rather like a ruin, but still an imposing presence, on which we build the dynamic future, the dynamic present that we have, even though that modernity, as a system of power and organization, is long gone. Think about the relationship that Schinkel had to ancient Greece in developing a whole new architectural form in Berlin in the 18th century. This is not about Greek cultural ownership of German architecture and German nation building, but it's about a direct influence. Think about modernity as that Acropolis that Schinkel sees and is inspired by. If this is possible, then it marks both a challenge, or if this is true, that modernity is our antiquity, then it marks both a challenge and an opportunity to institutions like museums that have spent their whole lifetime being born at the beginning of the modern, within the context of modernity, and which largely contain modernist relics. What we have in the museum are the relics of that modernity, are the ruins, except we've kept them so very well that they don't look like ruins. But maybe we have to start seeing them as ruins. It seems to me also that modernity, this modernity, is not something confined only to Europe and North America, but that those ruins lie across the world for reasons of colonialism and globalization, which we don't need to go into. But modernity has invested in the whole world, and there are constant attempts in every continent to keep those ruins upright. Therefore, if we could even attempt to build a planetary consciousness, we should consider how to share the aesthetic fruits of that modernity, and that is modernism, in ways that can help us to reuse its ruined architecture, to reimagine its propositions for the needs of the contemporary world. Museums in Western Europe and North America have locked up modernism in their collections, focusing on its ownership and its preservation, and much less on its active reuse. In doing so, they have locked up huge value for the world, both cultural, economic, and also, I would say, political, in one part of the world, and displaying that to the rest. This is surely the basic function, not only of the Van Abbe Museum, but also of the Tate or the Museum of Modern Art, to welcome tourists to New York or to London and to say, look how important we are. We have the relics of modernity. What I would propose is to set the resources locked up in those collections free by different, ethically appropriate means. A small percentage of this hoard of modernist objects could be traded, loaned, sold, or given away, and in the process, the cultural space and cultural money, space and money, will be generated within at least Western Europe, a society, I would say, that desperately needs such possibilities to think itself anew. It needs that space, literally that space in the depots, that space in the museums, but also that space in its head to think beyond the modern diktats that are still so common to our understanding. If museums, through the trading of their modernist hoards, could be independent or develop an independence from the largesse of economy or the instrumentalization of politics, we could then begin focusing on that discourse between politics, culture, and economics, and serve as a platform where those meetings could take place. Collections could still form the ground on which those discussions would happen, but a new dynamics would open up. A meeting place would emerge between different kinds of knowledge and the gaps between those knowledges and the understandings that might emerge between them, which would create a system of exchange and behavior, a peaceful confrontation of difference, which would lead through whatever processes we don't yet know, whatever emergent behavior, whatever as if an invisible hand would control that process, to different kinds of institutions. This, I believe, could be the purpose for European cultural institutions, one that would be joyful as well as important, and will offer the possibility to renew our old Europe and its value system, and to allow us to take part in the emerging one world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Charles, are you every now and then in life capable of empathy, of diving into the head and heart of other people?
I try to be, yeah. It's a hard task.
You try, okay. Let's say there's somebody who really opposes your ideas. Somebody who strongly believes in market economics and all that stuff. And I remember a guy who became an American president by saying, it's the economy, stupid. You remember him too. So there are people like that, and you're that kind of guy now.
I would also say it's the economy, stupid.
You're that guy now, and you're listening to Charles Escher. What is your strongest argument against the ideas of Charles Escher?
It's a hard one.
You said I'm capable of empathy, so...
No, but I mean, I'm not capable of empathy instantly, so you have to give me one moment to think.
Okay, dive into his mind.
I think he would talk about idealism and realism. And I think he would say that it's not possible to imagine those changes, that those changes just happen whether we like them or not, and we shouldn't try to control them.
Yeah.
I think he would say that society is the sum total of individual desires, and therefore the idea of talking about platforms for collective thinking is simply unrealistic.
And is that all crap? Is that all nonsense?
No, of course it's not nonsense, but I think it's a limited view. I mean, nothing is nonsense in a way, yeah? Not even Wilders is nonsense. The problem with Wilders is not what he says, but what he doesn't say, what he doesn't take on board, what he doesn't understand, what he refuses to understand.
Yeah.
And neoliberalism, I would say, is absolutely right through its own perspective. The problem is that that perspective, that lens, those glasses, if you like, are glasses that do not encompass human desire in its full, glorious, super complex form.
Yeah. Some political analysts wonder how it could have happened that there are still so many supporters of this system, this neoliberal system, after a few years of economic crisis. Do you have an explanation for the fact that it's still so popular, although the losses seem to be clear enough?
It's clear because there really is no alternative. I mean,
There's no alternative.
What was a proposition 25 years ago has become our truth. So therefore, to think about alternatives when you want to keep the market economy going, when you want to keep the relationship between public and private in the way that it is, when you want to keep the ownership of media in the way that it is, once you've said all these things are givens, then there is no way of thinking beyond it.
So does it mean there's no hope whatsoever anymore?
No, of course not. But it's absolutely not from the top down. It's not about the replacement of one ideology, neoliberalism, with another one, I don't know, neo-communism or something like that. No. That's not the answer. Yeah? The answer would be, as I've tried to suggest, that these behaviors can emerge in platforms which we can create. And if the European Union, for instance, had invested in those platforms and had taken over national education, rather than invest in the free market and invest in excuse me, the European Parliament, but had looked rather at culture and education, we would have had a far different Europe today.
Let's say you'd be a politician working on European level. Let's say you would be Barroso, and you would not be active in the cultural field, but you would work on the political side, and you'd have, just for a moment, unlimited power and money. Imagine. What would you do to change all this?
I'd make within the European Union, a pan-European primary school curriculum, in which every child from the age of 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 in Finland, I think, up until 11, got basically the same education. And that education would need to be written together and would be taken out of national government hands.
And you'd also stop religious schools like in Holland? You'd also stop religious schools like in Holland?
You would need to negotiate, but you'd need to have one curriculum. Who delivers that is another question. I don't think... Yeah.
Okay. One question to you. Who says, and I'd like to see your hand then, when I listen to speeches, I don't have any thought at all. I just sit down like a lame duck, and that's it. Can I see your... Okay, no hands. So I
A
see
very
one
special
hand.
audience.
So I'm going to come to you with a microphone and give you the opportunity to put forward your question, your remark, your idea. Who would like to have the microphone for a moment? You all just said, I don't just listen to the... So come on, raise your hand and put forward the question. Who's going to do that? You are, okay. And please be so kind as to introduce yourself to us. Hello.
Hello, my name is Maria Lind. Charles, it would be lovely to hear you speak a bit more about these collective platforms or platforms for collective thinking. Can you concretize a little bit?
I think it's very simple. You need to organize. People come to the museums. They exist at the moment as public spaces where people come to. So you have a resource. We have 100,000 people coming to the museum at the moment. That's half the population of Eindhoven. So therefore, you already have access to a public sphere. The question is, how can you create the participation? And I think it's through using the knowledge that those 100,000 people have and making them able to contribute to that open platform. And that means setting up mechanisms for them to respond, for them to contribute, for them to listen, and for them to speak. And I think there are some of those are known, but some of those we also have to work out in this emergent methodology, where we say, how can you contribute to this? And I think the urgency of why people would want to spend their time doing that rather than going shopping is something that will emerge quite rapidly in the next few years.
Thank you.
People will want to do that.
Who else would like to have the microphone? Okay. Nobody else? Yeah, you would like to? Go ahead.
Frits Lindmeijer, City of Utrecht. I would like to ask you, how do you can individual artisticy can bring up better source to your ideas about collectivism? So to make it more clear, perhaps art is an expression of individualism, and I would like to make that individualism let's contribute to common ideas.
I mean, it's interesting. You say, I think that's a modernist observation that art is related to individualism. What I see amongst the youngest generation of artists, and they're artists who are not necessarily even thinking about the museum, is that they're working far more collaboratively. Think about open source software, for instance, but think also about the kinds of groups that are emerging in the most interesting art schools or post-art school. And actually you see artists that are constantly working together and also looking to use knowledge outside of itself. I don't think the Renaissance man model, which is essentially a modernist model, is going to work here. The idea that in one body, in one figure, we can encapsulate all culture, all politics, all economics, and come up with the solution is going to work. So I'm not sure that individualism in itself is the way to go, and I don't think that's the way that art is developing as well. I think we need to step away from that.